when they invaded that part of the country. But anyway, it was right interesting. I appreciate Glenn's bringing that up because I never had really thought about it. And there's a lot of information about it if you want to read it.
I think the main thing we remember about them are all the human sacrifices. They were really big into sacrificing humans, like captives and slaves, and it was just a constant thing where they'd rip their heart out while they were still alive.
Yeah.
Really grotesque stuff. In the name of religion, in the name of appeasing their deity.
Right.
And it seems like every culture in the world has had some idea of sacrifice. And I believe it goes back eventually to the sons of Noah, and they knew somebody has to die because of sin, but they perverted that whole idea, completely corrupted.
Oh yeah, even way back in the Old Testament dispensation period of time, there were folks who offered their children to, was it Moloch and other gods, and a lot of that's a carryover, because first of all of these people's ancestors go back to Japheth and Ham and maybe some of Seth. I mean, there's just a kind of a mixture of this group because they were kind of like nomads, you might say, and they kind of went up into the part of Russia that gets close to Alaska and on over. It's a pretty historical.
Well, the fact that God told Abraham to offer his Isaac was way back.
Yeah, that's true. And people might get the idea, even from that maybe you need to do that. Who knows?
You know, the thing about that command is it was so radical a departure from anything God had ever commanded before or since. That's why it was such a supreme test of Abraham's faith, because it just didn't seem to be in character for God, because we're made in God's image, and he has never ever commanded human sacrifice anywhere except on that one occasion, and even then he didn't let Abraham follow through with it.
Right.
So I don't think you could use that like Barack Obama tried to do when he was a senator to make fun of religion. He was totally wrong about that.
And we don't know too much about Abraham's father, but we do know he worshipped idols. And we don't know what Abraham's heritage might have been along that line, but nevertheless, it was a test of his faith, and he was willing to do it because he believed God. And as he said to Isaac on the way up the mountain, when he said, "Where's the sacrifice?" he said God would provide. So he had enough faith in God that God would do what's right. And that's the position I take about all of us. When we get to the judgment day, God's going to do what's right. We can count on that. And it behooves us to do his will the best we can.
Walter wanted to say something.
Who?
Walter.
One interesting thing to me in that Incas or whatever tribes in South America, the Spaniards came in, and the emperor or this culture anyway, they got him to convert to Christianity. But as soon as he converted and was baptized, they killed him. I'm not sure which culture was.
Well, that might be a good time to die. Okay, we're on lesson 50. And we are entered into a period that we're going to refer to as the Dark Ages, although that's not a term that's used very frequently anymore. It's about a 1,000-year period. Well, there's I forgot to embed my fonts. Those characters are wingdings, but they spell the Dark Ages in Old English type, so I apologize for that. I saved it all to a new file, and I forgot to embed the fonts. I guess I'm getting old. Anyway, the Dark Ages has undergone many evolution. Its definition depends on who's defining it. You know, what people might say. Modern historians rarely use it because it's got a very negative connotation and it's not politically correct in the minds of a lot of people. But it referred to a period of time that was kind of ushered in by the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire. And that again, that's hard to pinpoint as to exactly what date, but generally speaking, they dated around 475, 476 AD as as the time that this kind of begins. And we're going to kind of look at some of the characteristics. It really, as far as I can tell, it wasn't called the Dark Ages during the Dark Ages. Kind of like I grew up poor, but I didn't know we were poor. You know, sometimes you don't recognize your own surroundings. You may be ignorant, but don't realize you are, you know, and so forth. But anyway, later on, around the 12th, 13th, 14th century, somewhere around there was a historian that called it the Dark Ages, and it was referred to that way for a long time, although today it's not. Modern historians usually just call it the Middle Ages, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. They said that it was because of the backward ways and practices that seemed to prevail during this time. The future historians use the term dark to denote the fact that little is known about this period. There was a paucity or scarcity of written history. Recent discoveries have apparently altered this perception, as many facts about this time have been uncovered. So as you read and study it, you'll find some folks that say, well, the Dark Ages weren't all that dark anyway. And we'll look at a couple of things about that. Since we're studying church history, we're going to refer more as to how this relates to the history of the church rather than the historical Dark Ages themselves, although it does intertwine a little bit. But it was a period of religious struggle. Now, keep in mind that not everybody agreed 100% with what we refer to as the Catholics, the departure from truth as we come down to 606 and found the development of the Pope by that time. But nevertheless, there were others that didn't exactly agree. And not all the leaders agreed. In other words, when you had the 5 patriarchs, for example, it's not saying they were all in complete unity. Sometimes they crystallize into groups, you know, birds of a feather. He believes more like I do. But they still had that one church concept, which we'll talk about again in just a minute. Orthodox Christians regard this as a time of Catholic corruption and repudiated the ways of the Catholic Church with its papal doctrines and hierarchy. Orthodox Christians strove to recreate a pure Christianity void of these dark Catholic ways. Catholics did not view this era as dark. They viewed it as a harmonious, productive religious era, and they often call it the golden years. The Bible was literally and figuratively chained to the pulpit. They say literally because of its price. Some say it took 1 year to 3 years' wages to own a Bible. I don't know how many people would give 1 year's wages for a Bible even today. It's the only way you could get one. I guess I'd do it like I was buying a house or a car, you know. Just find Amazon.com or some places like that and do the best you can to get one. But nevertheless, the Bibles were not very plentiful during this period of time. And even if they were, very few people could read and write during this period of time. This goes to, I guess, several factors. One would be there wasn't much to read about available. So why learn to read? Sometimes I talk about our ancestors who emphasized the 3 R's of religion: reading, writing, and arithmetic. And we see from that they couldn't spell. So anyway, the conditions didn't look good, and their only real hope was their strong faith in God and that heaven would be a better place to live.
So I guess, and I don't know if you mentioned this, maybe I missed it, but so is that why they had the Bibles chained up? Because I always hear about that, how the Catholic Church used to keep the Bibles chained, and the people couldn't just come up and
Well,
read it. Could steal it. Is that like the security devices on the movies at Walmart?
they say it was chained because of its value, keep the people from stealing it. But there also was a blanket effort to keep people from reading the Bible. So figuratively speaking, it was chained to the pulpit because people depended on what they heard from their preacher.
The main key to understanding Catholicism is their view that only the Pope and the hierarchy in the church have the right to interpret the Bible. So it wouldn't do us any good to read it. It might even be counterproductive, they would argue. They don't want, like you said, they don't want the individual to read it, and they never have, because that's their power base. It's power over the masses by saying, we are the elite, we alone can interpret it for you, we will think for you. That goes way back to their Italian ancestry, I believe. Tyranny has always been a part of the Roman Empire, the idea that the big guys will run everything for all the little guys.
And we're going to see more of that. We get about the 15th century and even before, when Bibles did become available, and when what people call the Renaissance, which is an awakening to literature and science, people wanted to read. And so when they did get their own Bibles, they did start reading for themselves. They saw what they'd been taught was not what they'd heard.
Didn't the Jewish leaders, though, didn't they kind of fall into that trap as well? Thinking that they knew better than the common man.
I don't know. I mean, it
seems like
they respected the Old Testament and the Torah, and
maybe it wasn't as rampant as with the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I don't know that they discouraged it, but they would still fall into the ignorance, people not being able to read or write, and so there would still be a certain amount of that present because of the non-availability, you might say, of copies of the Old Testament.
Did your average Jewish person have access to the
Well,
Torah?
probably be just like everybody else,
Word of mouth.
in my opinion. What?
I think the average Jew probably didn't have a copy, because it wasn't like a little Bible. It would be jars and jars full of scrolls after scrolls that take a lot of maintenance and a lot of money to make them. The synagogues would have them, so when they went to synagogue on Sabbath, there they could hear it, and get exposed to it. But it was an economic thing probably then. I think there was a similarity between the Jewish idea, they want to be called rabbi, great one, by the people, and be recognized as special. And they certainly believed they were the ones that had the right to interpret the law for everybody else. I don't know if it was as bad as it got to be under Catholicism in the Dark Ages, but it's a similar kind of thing. I think you could make a comparison.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even in latter times, it was not unusual to find the Torah, a pretty bulky thing, in a synagogue, and they protected it very much. Glenn?
Back when the bubonic plague, black two different names they called it. There was millions of people died, and then the printing press was invented, and they took, they didn't have much to make paper out of, and they took the clothes from the dead people and started making paper, and that's when they got to having more paper to use to make Bibles and different books.
Yeah, and of course another thing, the monks copied, even though they couldn't read, and in a way, this might be a good thing about the preservation of the original text, you might say. If all they did was copy the symbols and not really understanding what it was saying, they wouldn't be tempted to give their own interpretation of it. They would just copy it as it was.
I guess two quick things. It goes back then to the importance, because as you say, you wouldn't have necessarily had access to a written copy. You would go and you would listen to it being spoken. So, of course, I'm sure that boiled down to the fact that a lot of people couldn't read, so they would hear. So that goes back to the importance of hearing the word and hearing it preached or spoken accurately, which is interesting because when the church got started and you had the gift of tongues imparted, it shows you, I guess, the contrast between the idea that we need to keep this information as restricted as possible, and we need to have it come down from just the people that we assign, as opposed to God, who imparted that gift to as many people as was necessary to get the word out to the masses. So it's an interesting. Seems like it's an interesting dichotomy between God, who wants the word imparted to as many people as possible, and man, who would like to have it restricted and controlled.
That's true. This also was a period of time that there was a lot of Muslim conquest. And, of course, ignorance of Scripture is a good fertile soil for error and for false religions and so forth. And so I think you can kind of see why during this period of time it could have been in some areas, and these were bloody battles. I mean, people lost their lives, just like Walter mentioned a while ago. People lost their lives over this. And I think Philip mentioned something a few weeks ago about the mixed emotions about the Crusades because of what they were accomplishing and yet of all the bloodshed. And of course, that conflict remains today between Christianity and Islam. But as you can see where it got its foundation here in the age of ignorance. This is an interesting thing to me because the Dark Ages have the redeeming feature of medieval art, glorious cathedrals, illuminated missals. I think these were like tapestries and things. Exquisite paintings. The church, as it was at that time, pretends it pulled Europe through the Dark Ages, and yet they ignore the truth that they were largely responsible for them. And yet we can see why they might call it the golden years, because of their growth. Now we use the word Christian here to refer to all of those in the apostasy. The leaders said one of the symptoms of the end of the world was the spread of knowledge. So we can see from these kind of statements how they suppressed any desire to read and learn. And they had wholesale book burnings, they destroyed libraries and schools, They opposed education. By the end of the 5th century, Christian rulers forcibly abolished the study of philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and geography. I don't know how to pronounce that guy's name, but he, one of the leaders said no Christian should study astronomy. Well, I don't know whether I agree or disagree with that. But anyway, the idea was that there was a lot of suppression of learning, keeping people, you might say, chained into the ignorance that, I mean, as you can see over this period of time, how that would evolve. Gregory I, called Gregory the Great, who was a patriarch in Rome from 590 to 604. Now this is toward the end of the patriarch in Constantinople and the entrance, you might say, of Boniface III in 606. But he denounced all secular education as folly and wickedness and forbade Christian laymen to read even the Bible. He burned the library of the Palatine Apollo, lest its secular literature distract the faithful from the contemplation of heaven. So you can kind of see how they perpetuated the darkness of ignorance during this period of time. We mentioned this man before, John IV, or sometimes known as John the Faster, who was the patriarch in Constantinople. You remember there were 5 patriarchs at that time: Ephesus, Jerusalem, Rome, Constantinople, and Alexandria, yeah. Anyway, I don't know if he self-claimed or whether it was given to him. He called a council, and out of that council he became the universal bishop, you might say. Although he didn't, even though that council in 588, it was a couple of years before he actually, you might say, started using that. But you can imagine the reaction others would have, especially Rome, because Rome all through this time, for some reason, was considering their patriarch to be the successor of Peter and the patriarch, and you might say that deserved to be. And it was in 606 that Boniface III, this was after the death of John the Faster, and he became known as the, you might say, the Pope or the Universal Bishop. But he only lived about 6 months after that, and I forget who took his place. But the Eastern Church, that is the Constantinople group, never really accepted the control of the Western Church, which would be Rome. And in 1054, there was an official distinction made. And we'll talk about that in our next lesson and look at some of the disagreements and some of the differences between what we know today as the Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox, or Eastern and Western. But anyway, that division had been brewing for a long time. But nevertheless, it took it a few years before they had an official break. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because they had a strong feeling toward the oneness of the church. I mean, that seemed to be a prevailing thought all during this period of time. Let's look at now some of the doctrinal issues that were going on all during this time, and even prior to this period of time, was there was always a little controversy about the deity of Christ. There were 2 or 3 different views floating around, and some they crystallize into groups. Dispensationalism, they're more premillennialists, you might say. Now, we understand the dispensations to be 3, the way God dispensed his message, patriarchal and Mosaical and Christian. But those folks have about 7 dispensations, and one goes beyond the second coming. And so there's even back then there was a lot of discussion about that, and there was some end times disagreements, you might say. The doctrines on baptism, they had a lot of discussion, especially concerning the mode of baptism as they introduced sprinkling, the subjects as they introduced infants, and the purpose. We know what the Bible teaches as to the purpose of baptism, but there was a tendency in the minds of some to move away from that, although the very fact that infant baptism was introduced indicated a strong conviction about the necessity of it. There was some other things that took place all during this time, image worship, and this was brought about because of the idol worshipers, and you might go back to Constantine when Christianity was made the state religion, and everybody wanted to be a part of it, and everybody was kind of accepted as they were. They brought in a lot of their idol worship ideas. At some point, the adoration of Mary and praying to Mary, a distinction between what they call the clergy and the laity. And this is one of the points that Martin Luther zeroed in on, as well as some of the other reformers, because the Bible does not make the kind of distinction that was being made. And there was also that constant battle about the church and the state. Now, I believe the Eastern Church had more the idea that the church ruled the state and the Western state ruled the church, or vice versa. I'm not sure, but there's still that conflict going on. And of course, Jesus made a distinction when he said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's." And our forefathers wanted to make sure that not only religion would rule the state, but the state would not rule religion. And sometimes people kind of get that mixed up and crossed up, but we are 2 identities. The monks, and of course the departure from the multiplicity of elders and autonomy of congregations that eventually ended up to be the Pope. It's kind of interesting when you look at all of the changes that begin to take place during this period of time. I want to make just a couple of observations before we move into the next phase. The one church concept basic was maintained during this first, what you might say, 400 or 500 years of the Dark Ages, although it was beginning to turn to a denominational concept of, yes, there is one universal church, and we're all members of it. And that's the denominational view today. When pressed on the one church, yeah, there is one church, and all the churches are part of that one church. They view the denomination idea like we view the congregational idea. Yeah, there's one church, but there are several congregations. Even in the New Testament, there was the churches of Galatia, the churches of Asia. But as we learned in an earlier study, they were not various denominations with various doctrines. And they were all encouraged to speak the same thing and be perfected together in the same mind and the same judgment. But nevertheless, that was this concept. But as division began, of course, the denominational description of it began to emerge. Did you start to say something?
Oh, I was just going to go back to that point you had about the separation of church and state. And I was going to, I guess, just pose a question. In Romans 13, it says, let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. For the rulers aren't a terror to good works, but to the evil. So basically God ordains those that are in power. So you have that idea, but then you have the church, which its headship is the head of the church is Christ, who's in heaven. So you have this idea of church and the state, and yet the state is ordained from God. So I guess it would beg the question, why wouldn't then the church be the state or the state be the church? And why wouldn't you have the two merged? There must be therefore a reason for having the two separated like that.
Yeah.
And sometimes the people that are in control, again, you go back to, I heard Obama's name mentioned before. Why would somebody like that, who was clearly, anti-Christian, God in general, be put in charge of the United States? Or, why would somebody like Hitler or et cetera, et cetera?
Right.
What would be the purpose of those leaders?
I don't know, and not only do we have the government and the church, we also have the home. And while all three are intertwined, there are different rules for each. I mean, there are things that we do as a family in the home that we don't do as worship in the church and things like that. But sometimes people have a difficulty in making those distinctions. And the church-state thing was a pretty strong thing.
I think the simplistic answer about Obama and people like that is we live in a republic where we still have the right to vote for our leaders. And too many people are voting for bad leaders because they have been persuaded that Christianity and traditional morality is not true or not relevant any longer. They've adopted a secular worldview, so they are appealed to by that mentality. That's the answer there, and God allows that. People get what they want. God does not force things on it. If our nation wants an Obama, we're going to get it, and all the sad consequences that go with it. It's really sad, but that's true.
Well, I mean, God gave the Jews a king, even though that was not his best choice.
Because they wanted it.
It just struck me, though, maybe the idea is that, God, to say that God is in control of who he decides who is, but really Obama's not the one, or whoever, is president is not really the one that God necessarily appointed, but we're the ones, right? I mean, God has appointed us as the rulers of our own country in that maybe
government of the people.
Wrote. That's what God has, and he has done that perhaps, to allow us that ability because, he wants us to see what happens when we do elect people that are.
And we have Old and New Testament examples of what you are to do when the government demands you to do something that's contrary to what God demands. And we'll go back to Daniel and people like that, but even in the New Testament, Peter said we ought to obey God rather than man when he was told by the officials, don't you preach this gospel anymore. So we have an allegiance higher than the president, you might say. And while we're told to pray for them and while we respect them and all of that, we still have an allegiance to do what God said do first and foremost. Does not mean that we're trying to control the state, or rule the country, but we have instructions on how to live.
But you know, it also that reminds me of back when the Jews had the judges, and then they demanded to have a king, and God let them have a king, and He said, you won't like it, but I'll let you do it anyway. And so it kind of reminds me of maybe where we are now, that we started this country, and God allowed, and it worked for a long time, and still works sometimes. When the people vote for the right things, but it can go bad pretty quickly, as we see.
Well, all of God's designs are perfect. Church, the home, the government. The imperfection comes from us in all three. Just because they're ordained of God does not mean that they're all doing God's will and doing what God wants to be done. And there was a period of time, and still a little bit, but not like it used to be, that preachers were saying to Christians, you don't even vote. You just stay out of politics altogether. And
David Lipscomb took that view, and in his defense, although it's a wrong view, he was wrong. But the reason why he took it was he was in Nashville when the Great War for Southern Independence broke out. And after a long struggle for trying to do the right thing, eventually the forces of violence and the superior forces finally won out. And that ideal was not realized. So he was bewildered. He didn't know which side to choose. He was torn on the Romans 13 thing about the federal government, although Romans 13 applies to a government in Montgomery just as it would in Washington. And anyway, he just threw up his hand and said, we can't decide, we need to stay out of politics. And that mentality has carried on, and it was also dominant among a lot of other denominational groups in the early 20th century, to absolute devastation of Christianity. Because once we abandoned the marketplace of ideas and just cloistered ourselves within the four walls of our church building, we ceased to have much influence at all on society, and we just left it to the forces of secularism. We just said, oh, they're no good, they're bad, that's the way they're going to be. Then one day we woke up and realized even our public school systems are dominated by it, and our kids are being taught things that are contrary to what we're teaching them in church. We realized the mistake, so there's a lot of lost time we have to make up for because of that mentality.
A lot of those views came from the statement of Daniel that God wills who will serve, that they're saying, no point in us voting because God's in control and things like that. But I think God has taught us through His Word that He accomplishes things through mediums. Just like we pray for the sick, but we also pray for the doctors and the medication, because God uses what you might say natural things to accomplish great things. And while it's true that there's a lot of corruption in government, and while it's true that even good people who go into politics turn out bad, doesn't mean that it's wrong. There's still a responsibility that we have.
Well, it's like saying, well, God gives me free will, but yet, God's going to do what God is going to do, so therefore I might as well just, not really have a choice. I mean, you're abdicating, and God has ordained, the type of government we have, which is to allow us to select our own leaders. So if we're not voting, if we're not engaging politically, we're taking the gift that God has given us, and we're neglecting it. We're either that or refusing it. I mean, that's really, again, I go back to that. I think that really is an important idea that, the president is not really the one in charge. We're the one in charge. God has given us that responsibility to govern our own selves. And if we're not doing that, if we're not engaging in that, then
eventually we will lose that privilege, and it will fall on the elite exclusively. That's
well, God puts what you might say reservations and checkpoints on all of this. For example, elders are to rule the church, not with an iron hand or thumbs down, so to speak, but there again, we're told also that we can challenge them Now, we to do it in the right way, 2 or 3 witnesses, something like that, but we don't have to submit ourselves to any rule that causes us to disobey God, no matter who they are. And I think that's the thing we learn. Let me finish this point, then we'll pick this up next week. For the most part, during this time, baptism was still essential, even though the mode was construed different ways, you could sprinkle, pour, whatever. But it's still considered essential. Even though you could baptize infants, it was still essential for the most part. The Lord's Supper was still observed at least weekly. It's interesting, when changes were made with the Lord's Supper, it was more frequent, not less frequent, during this period of time. So today we have people who just, once, twice, 3 times a year or whatever. But even during this period, and this is interesting to me, with all of the changes that took place these first 500, 600, 700 years, singing was still a cappella. Now, we sometimes refer to a cappella as just singing without an instrument, but that's really not what the word meant. It's a Latin word that really meant that's the way it's done in the church, a cappella. And we'll study quite a bit about it, but the singing was, even during all of this time, up until the late 7th century, I guess, there was no suggestion to use instruments of music in worship. And we'll pick up at this point next week. Thank you.